Today's story uncovers 3 terrifying cases of serial killers who turned ordinary streets into hunting grounds. First, the infamous DC sniper case, where a duo's random shootings paralyzed the Washington, D.C. area with fear, leaving a trail of tragedy and chaos. Then, the chilling story of Lonnie Franklin, known as the Grim Sleeper, a serial killer who eluded justice for decades while targeting vulnerable women in Los Angeles. Finally, the case of the Phoenix serial street shooter, whose random attacks left a city on edge before investigators closed in on the killer. But before we begin, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place. We upload daily, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Alright, let's get into today's story. On an early October morning in 2002, the quiet streets of Montgomery County, Maryland, were bathed in the soft hues of dawn. The air was crisp, and the suburban neighborhood stirred to life with the familiar routines of the day. Cars hummed softly in driveways, children prepared for school, and commuters filled their travel mugs before heading out. It was a scene of normalcy, a comforting monotony, until it wasn't. At 7:41 a.m., the peace was shattered. James Martin, a 55-year-old program analyst, was standing in a parking lot near a Shoppers Food warehouse. The sun was just beginning to climb, its light filtering through the trees. James, a beloved father and husband, had no idea his life was about to intersect with something unimaginable. A sudden crack echoed through the air, a sharp, piercing sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. James staggered, his body crumpling to the asphalt as blood pooled beneath him. Witnesses froze in shock, their morning routines obliterated by a single, incomprehensible act of violence. Within minutes, first responders arrived, but it was already too late. James Martin was pronounced dead on the scene. The randomness of the act sent ripples of terror through the community. Who would target a man like James, a devoted father, a professional with no known enemies? The answer seemed impossible to grasp, but this was only the beginning. That same evening, less than 12 hours later, another life was claimed. 39-year-old James Sonny Buchanan was mowing the grass outside a car dealership in Rockville, Maryland, just a few miles away from the morning's tragedy. The hum of the mower blended into the suburban soundtrack, drowning out the faint, almost imperceptible pop of a distant shot. Sonny faltered, his hands gripping the mower's handle as he collapsed. Witnesses at the dealership initially thought he had suffered a medical emergency. It wasn't until they saw the blood soaking his shirt that the gravity of the situation became clear. A single bullet had pierced his upper body, killing him almost instantly. 2 shootings, both in broad daylight, within the same day. Panic began to seep into the edges of normalcy. By the following day, terror had escalated into outright fear. At 8:12 a.m., Prem Kumar Walekar, a 54-year-old taxi driver, was refueling his cab at a mobile gas station in Aspen Hill, Maryland. As the pump clicked, signaling his tank was full, a single shot rang out. Prem Kumar collapsed beside his cab, the fuel nozzle still in his hand. There were no arguments, no confrontation, just a sudden and devastating end to an otherwise ordinary morning. The pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Each victim was struck down with precision, seemingly out of nowhere, and always with a single, lethal shot. No witnesses saw the shooter. No one heard the gunfire's origin. The victims had no connections, no shared enemies. It was as if death itself had decided to descend on this quiet suburban area. Later that morning, at 8:37 a.m., Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old housekeeper, sat on a bench outside a post office in Silver Spring, Maryland. She was enjoying the morning air, her purse and a book by her side. The bench was in plain sight, surrounded by businesses and early risers. It should have been safe. But safety was an illusion. A single shot ended Sarah's life. Her body slumped forward, the book she had been reading slipping from her hands onto the pavement. Bystanders rushed to her aid, but it was futile. Within minutes, the police arrived, marking yet another crime scene in what was now a string of horrifying murders. The final killing of the day occurred at 9:58 a.m. Lorianne Lewis Rivera, a 25-year-old nanny, was vacuuming her minivan at a gas station in Kensington, Maryland. Her toddler was safely inside the vehicle, babbling happily as Lori cleaned the carpets. The serene domestic moment was shattered by a single gunshot. Lori collapsed onto the asphalt, her life extinguished in an instant. The child, unharmed but crying in confusion, was rescued by witnesses who called the police. The scene was chaotic, mothers clutching their children, onlookers staring in disbelief, and officers scrambling for answers. The randomness of the violence was paralyzing. No one could predict where or when the next bullet would strike. By the end of October 3rd, 5 lives had been taken. 5 ordinary people going about their day, ambushed by an invisible force of terror. News of the killings spread like wildfire, and the nation watched in horror as the story unfolded. Montgomery County became a place of fear, its streets eerily quiet as residents avoided public spaces. The police, overwhelmed by the sudden escalation, scrambled to find connections. Was this the work of a single individual or a coordinated group? Were the killings random, or was there a motive hidden beneath the surface? The questions outnumbered the answers, and as night fell, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary spree of violence. It was calculated, cold, and terrifyingly effective. As darkness enveloped the town, the killer, or killers, were still out there, unseen and seemingly unstoppable. And the nightmare had only just begun. The morning after the 5th tragedy dawned, and a heavy, suffocating fear gripped Montgomery County. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily silent. Schools remained open, but attendance plummeted as parents feared for their children's safety. Gas stations, once a routine stop for commuters, became places of paranoia. Every glance over the shoulder, every suspicious movement in the distance was magnified into a potential threat. It felt as though the entire community was being hunted. But by whom? Investigators were equally baffled and burdened by the weight of the unfolding nightmare. The 5 victims shared no commonalities, different ages, different backgrounds, different routines. There was no apparent motive, no discernible pattern beyond the chilling fact that each was taken by a single, precise shot. Forensic teams combed through the crime scenes for hours, desperate to find anything. A shell casing, a footprint, a strand of hair that could point them toward the perpetrator. But the killer was meticulous. The only evidence left behind was a growing sense of dread and confusion. That same day, Chief Charles Moose, the lead investigator, addressed the public in a press conference. Standing at a podium surrounded by microphones, his face etched with exhaustion, he urged calm but could offer few concrete answers. "We are doing everything in our power to bring whoever is responsible to justice," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "We ask that the community remain vigilant and report anything suspicious. Together, we will solve this." But together wasn't enough to quell the storm of fear. Calls flooded 911 dispatchers with reports of suspicious vehicles, shadowy figures, and strange noises. Each tip was followed up, but none led to the elusive shooter or shooters. Behind the scenes, the investigation was a flurry of activity. Ballistics experts confirmed what officers already feared. The same weapon had been used in all 5 attacks. The rifle, likely a .223 caliber, was capable of inflicting devastating damage from a distance, reinforcing the theory that the killer was an experienced marksman. But beyond the weapon, little else was certain. The unease deepened as October 4th wore on, and the nightmare continued. At 2:30 p.m., Pascal Charlotte, a 72-year-old retired carpenter, was walking along Georgia Avenue in Washington, D.C. He was on his way to run an errand, his steps slow but steady. The streets were still busy, with cars zipping by and pedestrians going about their day. Yet, in the blink of an eye, the ordinary became horrific. A single shot echoed through the air. Pascal collapsed onto the sidewalk, clutching his chest as onlookers screamed and scattered. Traffic halted abruptly, drivers abandoning their vehicles to rush to the man's aid. But by the time paramedics arrived, Pascal's life had already slipped away. The randomness of the attack added to the terror. How could anyone predict where the killer might strike next? The geographic range of the shootings was expanding, moving beyond Montgomery County into Washington, D.C., suggesting that no one, no matter where they lived, was truly safe. As law enforcement scrambled to respond to the new scene, another question loomed larger. Was this escalation intentional? Were the attacks moving closer to the heart of the nation's capital, a deliberate message? Or was the shooter simply opportunistic? By now, the task force assembled to address the crisis had grown exponentially. Federal agencies, including the FBI and ATF, joined local law enforcement in what was becoming one of the largest manhunts in recent history. Hundreds of officers and agents were assigned to follow leads, patrol neighborhoods, and analyze forensic evidence. Yet, the killer seemed to operate with impunity. Witnesses described hearing the shots, but never saw where they came from. No one recalled spotting anyone suspicious before or after the attacks. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air after each act. Then came the first clue, a chilling one. Near the scene of Pascal Charlotte's murder, investigators discovered a tarot card, the death card, tucked inside a plastic bag. On its surface was a cryptic message scrawled in bold handwriting, "Call me God." The discovery sent shivers through the task force. Was this truly a message from the killer, or a cruel prank by someone seeking attention? If genuine, it suggested the killer was not only methodical, but also deeply twisted. The phrase, "Call me God," hinted at a desire for power and control, a belief that they could act with impunity, deciding who lived and who didn't. But the card also posed another question. Why leave it now? What had changed in the killer's mind, and what did it mean for the violence yet to come? The press learned of the card almost immediately, and the phrase, "Call me God," dominated headlines across the country. For the first time, the public had a glimpse into the mind of the person, or people, terrorizing their communities. It was a mind that was confident, calculating, and cruel. As night fell again, the killer remained at large. Law enforcement set up roadblocks, increased patrols, and urged residents to stay indoors. But for all their efforts, they could not shake the feeling that they were always one step behind. And somewhere in the dark, the hunter was watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. As the investigation deepened, so did the sense of foreboding that had settled over the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Days had passed since the first shots were fired, and while law enforcement was beginning to piece together fragments of evidence, the killer's identity and their motives remained an enigma. Each sunrise brought a renewed sense of dread. Each sunset the realization that the nightmare wasn't over. On the morning of October 7th, a new note was discovered near the scene of a shooting in Bowie, Maryland. A 13-year-old boy had been critically injured while standing outside his school. The child had been with his aunt, heading toward the building, when a single distant shot rang out. In an instant, the boy fell to the ground, clutching his chest. Chaos erupted. Teachers, parents, and students scrambled for cover, their screams filling the air. Paramedics arrived quickly, rushing the boy to the hospital, where he was stabilized. His survival brought a sliver of relief, but it also deepened the community's fear. The shooter had struck at a school, a place meant to be a sanctuary. Nowhere felt safe. The note found nearby was written in a similar style to the tarot card discovered earlier, but this time it contained chilling demands. Addressed to law enforcement, it stated, "We have caught you. We will continue to make things worse. Your children are not safe anywhere at any time." The language was cold, calculated, and devoid of empathy. It confirmed what the public had feared. The killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a deliberate plan designed to instill terror. The demands in the note included a monetary ransom, adding another layer to the shooter's twisted psyche. They wanted attention, control, and now, financial gain. But it wasn't the money that unsettled investigators the most. It was the implication that the violence would not end, not until the killer's conditions were met. Behind closed doors, Law enforcement debated their next move. Should they go public with the note and risk spreading further panic? Or should they keep the information contained, hoping it would give them an edge in tracking the perpetrator? The decision was fraught with consequences. Every moment wasted meant the possibility of another victim. In the meantime, roadblocks were set up across the region. Officers inspected vehicles for anything out of the ordinary: rifles, ammunition, signs of a hidden sniper. They were looking for someone, anyone, who might fit the profile of a person capable of orchestrating such a campaign of terror. But the killer had already proven themselves to be a master of evasion. They left no witnesses, no fingerprints, no traceable connections. The key to the investigation came not from the streets, but from the forensics lab. Ballistics experts had analyzed the bullet casings and determined that they were consistent with a Bushmaster 223 rifle, a weapon known for its accuracy and lethality. The information was a breakthrough, but it was also a grim reminder of the killer's skill. Whoever was behind the attacks was not only proficient with firearms, but also patient and methodical, a predator with a purpose. This new understanding prompted a shift in strategy. Investigators began cross-referencing purchase records for 223 rifles, hoping to narrow down a list of suspects. At the same time, analysts reviewed footage from surveillance cameras near the crime scenes. One of these reviews led to a subtle but significant lead: a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice spotted leaving multiple areas shortly after the shootings. The vehicle didn't stand out at first glance. It was old, unassuming, the kind of car that could easily blend into traffic. But as investigators continued to analyze the footage, the same car appeared time and time again. It became the thread they desperately needed, a piece of the puzzle that might finally bring the bigger picture into focus. The public, still reeling from the growing list of victims, was now being asked to stay vigilant for a blue sedan. The plea from law enforcement was met with a mix of relief and skepticism. Relief, because it felt like progress was being made. Skepticism, because the fear was still palpable. Could the authorities really stop someone who had eluded them so completely? As the investigation homed in on the car, another chilling realization emerged. The killer wasn't working alone. Witness reports and forensic evidence suggested there were two individuals involved, one to fire the weapon and another to assist with logistics. This revelation sent shockwaves through the task force. If there were two perpetrators, the level of coordination and planning required for these attacks was far greater than anyone had anticipated. It also meant that catching them would be twice as difficult. That evening, as the search for the Chevrolet Caprice intensified, a new shooting was reported. A man filling his gas tank in Fredericksburg, Virginia, became the latest victim. The scene was all too familiar: a single shot, a lifeless body, and a killer who seemed to vanish into thin air. This time, however, the aftermath carried an eerie weight. Witnesses described hearing a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of a car engine idling nearby. It wasn't much, but it was enough to renew focus on the elusive vehicle. The investigation was gaining momentum, but the killers were still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. The darkness of October pressed down like a heavy fog, each passing day deepening the fear that gripped the region. Law enforcement now had a focus: a blue Chevrolet Caprice. But that was little comfort to the people who continued their lives in a state of heightened vigilance. The killers moved like shadows, striking without warning and vanishing before anyone could react. On the evening of October 9th, another life was claimed. Dean Harold Myers, a 53-year-old engineer, was pumping gas at a Sunoco station in Manassas, Virginia. The station was well lit, bustling with activity, but it made difference. As he reached for the nozzle, a single shot rang out. Dean collapsed instantly, his hand still outstretched. The scene erupted in chaos, but the result was all too familiar. The attacker was gone before anyone even registered what had happened. The methodical nature of the violence left investigators on edge. The killers were operating with chilling precision, seemingly unbothered by the extensive manhunt. Every move they made was calculated to avoid detection, and each shooting only added to the puzzle. The public's unease turned to outright paranoia. People began avoiding gas stations, walking in zigzag patterns to avoid presenting an easy target, and looking over their shoulders constantly. Say ye be. Behind the scenes, the task force was working around the clock, sifting through hundreds of tips and sightings. The blue Chevrolet Caprice was spotted multiple times, but never in the same location twice. The killers seemed to be taunting their pursuers, staying just out of reach. Investigators began to suspect the vehicle itself was key to their strategy, perhaps even modified in ways that made their attacks easier to execute. Theories swirled about how they were carrying out their crimes. Some speculated about a hidden compartment, others about the possibility of firing from inside the car itself. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A police officer in Washington, D.C., remembered an earlier encounter with a blue Chevrolet Caprice parked in a rest area. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant, but in light of recent developments, the memory stood out. The officer recalled the license plate number and passed it along to investigators. This was the lead they had been waiting for. The vehicle was traced to a man named John Allen Mohammed, a Gulf War veteran with a troubled past. His connection to the killings wasn't immediately clear, but a deeper dive into his background revealed troubling details. Mohammed had a history of erratic behavior and a volatile personality. Investigators also uncovered a connection to a teenager, Lee Boyd Malvo, who had been seen with him in recent months. The two had reportedly been living out of the car, traveling across state lines, and keeping a low profile. As investigators pieced together their movements, a horrifying realization began to take shape. The Caprice wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was their weapon. Further analysis confirmed what many had feared. The car had been modified to allow a rifle to be fired from inside. A small hole near the trunk provided a clear line of sight for the shooter while keeping the weapon, and the person pulling the trigger, completely concealed. It was a chillingly efficient setup, designed to maximize their ability to kill without being detected. The discovery of the car's modifications only deepened the urgency of the manhunt. Every officer on the task force knew that as long as the killers remained free, the violence would continue. The search for the Caprice intensified, with roadblocks and checkpoints set up across the region. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned wooded areas, while officers patrolled highways and rest stops. But for every lead that brought them closer, the killers seemed to find a way to slip through their grasp. The pair's ability to evade capture wasn't just luck, it was strategy. Mohammed's military training had taught him how to operate under pressure, to think several steps ahead of his adversaries. Malvo, though younger and less experienced, had clearly been molded in Mohammed's image. Together, they operated with a frightening level of coordination, using the Caprice as both their sanctuary and their weapon. Then came a moment of chilling clarity. As investigators mapped the locations of the shootings, a pattern emerged. The attacks formed a rough geographic circle, with Washington, D.C. at its center. It was as though the killers were creating a zone of terror, striking seemingly at random but always staying within a defined radius. This revelation narrowed the search area significantly, giving law enforcement a chance to concentrate their resources. But the killers were not content to let the pressure dictate their actions. On October 19th, they struck again, this time in Ashland, Virginia. A 37-year-old man was hit while walking through a restaurant parking lot. The attack followed the same pattern. A single shot, no witnesses, no trace of the shooter. But this time the killers left behind another note. Written in the same bold handwriting as the first, it repeated their demands and issued a stark warning: you have until Monday to comply. The ultimatum set off a wave of panic within the task force. Negotiators were brought in, analysts dissected every word of the message, and officers redoubled their efforts to locate the Caprice. The killers had made their intentions clear. They were in control, and they had no intention of stopping. As the clock ticked down toward the deadline, the region braced itself for what might come next. The killers had proven their ability to strike at will, and now they had added the weight of a looming ultimatum. Law enforcement knew they were racing against time, but even with the new leads and mounting pressure, the killers remained just out of reach. The tension was unbearable. With the killers' ultimatum looming, the task force worked feverishly to locate the blue Chevrolet Caprice. Every available resource was mobilized. Officers scanned highways, agents combed through tips, and surveillance teams monitored key locations. The killers had proven themselves to be cunning and elusive, but the net was beginning to tighten. On October 22nd, as investigators pored over leads, the killers struck again. This time, their target was Conrad Johnson, a 35-year-old bus driver in Aspen Hill, Maryland. Conrad was preparing to begin his route, standing at the entrance of his bus, when a single shot found its mark. Witnesses heard the sound but saw nothing, only the sudden collapse of a man who had been moments away from starting his day. The community's reaction was immediate and visceral. The randomness of the attack, hitting a public servant in plain sight, felt like a direct assault on the fragile sense of order people were desperately clinging to. With this latest tragedy, the killers had reinforced their message: no one was beyond their reach. As law enforcement scrambled to respond, a crucial break came in the investigation. A call from a tipster provided a critical piece of information. The blue Caprice had been spotted at a rest area off Interstate 70 in Frederick County, Maryland. The caller, an alert truck driver, had noticed the vehicle parked suspiciously and connected it to the description plastered across the news. Within minutes, officers converged on the location. The Caprice was there, parked and seemingly abandoned. The vehicle was unassuming at first glance, but investigators approached with caution, their weapons drawn. The killers had shown no hesitation in their attacks, and no one was willing to take unnecessary risks. As officers closed in, they discovered that the car wasn't empty. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo were found asleep inside, their plan disrupted by the vigilance of an ordinary citizen. The relief among law enforcement was palpable, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. The investigation had captured its suspects, but now the task of piecing together the full extent of their crimes began. The Caprice itself was a treasure trove of evidence. Inside the trunk, investigators found the Bushmaster rifle that had been used in the shootings, along with a tripod mount designed for precision targeting. The modifications to the car were as chilling as expected. A hole drilled in the rear allowed the shooter to fire undetected, turning the vehicle into a mobile weapon. Interrogations of Muhammad and Malvo revealed a dynamic as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Muhammad, the older of the two, was clearly the leader, calm, calculating, and deeply manipulative. Malvo, just 17 years old, was impressionable and eager to please the man he saw as a father figure. Together, they had formed a partnership fueled by control and obedience, their bond twisted into a tool for violence. But the most unsettling revelation came from Malvo's statements. Under questioning, he described the pair's motivations with a chilling detachment. The killings, he explained, were part of a larger plan to instill fear and demand a ransom. Muhammad had envisioned using the money to establish a camp where they could train others to carry out similar acts, creating a network of terror that would ripple across the country. The shootings, random as they seemed, were calculated steps toward a much darker goal. The public's reaction to the arrests was a mixture of relief and disbelief. The killers' identities, a military veteran and a teenager, were as confounding as their crimes. How could someone who had once served their country turn to such calculated acts of violence? And how could a young man be drawn so completely into this web of destruction? The questions hung in the air, unanswered but unavoidable. In the days that followed, the full scope of Muhammad and Malvo's spree came into focus. The pair was linked to shootings not just in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., but also in other states. Each new revelation added another layer of tragedy, another name to the list of lives forever changed by their actions. Even as the killers sat in custody, the fear they had sown lingered. The methods they employed, the anonymity of distance, the randomness of their targets, the mobile nature of their attacks, had exposed vulnerabilities no one wanted to confront. The arrests had brought an end to the violence, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. For investigators, the work was far from over. The task force shifted its focus to building a case that would ensure justice for the victims and their families. The evidence was overwhelming. The rifle, the modified car, the notes, and Malvo's statements all painted a damning picture. But as the case moved toward the courtroom, the question of why still loomed large. What had driven two people, so different in age and background, to commit such acts? It was a question that would haunt everyone involved long after the trial concluded. The courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for space. Victims' families clutched one another's hands, and spectators sat in stunned silence as the proceedings against John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo began. The weight of their crimes had cast a shadow, not only over the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, but also across the nation. Now, the world would finally hear the full story of their calculated reign of terror. Prosecutors began by laying out the chilling timeline of the attacks, starting with the first shooting in Montgomery County and ending with the arrest at the rest area off Interstate 70. Evidence was presented methodically. The Bushmaster rifle, the notes left at crime scenes, and the modifications to the Chevrolet Caprice that allowed it to serve as a mobile weapon. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the killers, calculated strategy, and their disturbing precision. One of the most damning moments came when prosecutors played audio recordings of Lee Boyd Malvo's interviews. In a calm, detached voice, Malvo described how Muhammad had carefully planned each step of their operation. He explained how they chose their targets, randomly, yet always with the intent to spread fear. Gas stations, parking lots, and public spaces were selected because they were places people felt safe. Muhammad's goal was not just to take lives, but to create a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Malvo's testimony revealed more than just their methods. It also shed light on their twisted relationship. Muhammad, a man in his 40s, had taken the teenager under his wing, presenting himself as a mentor and protector. Malvo's own troubled past made him susceptible to Muhammad's influence, and he had followed his lead without question. The dynamic was one of control and manipulation, with Muhammad using Malvo as both an accomplice and a weapon. For the victims' families, the trial was an emotional roller coaster. Each new detail brought a fresh wave of pain, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. They listened as prosecutors recounted the final moments of their loved ones' lives, their anguish mirrored in the tearful faces around them. But there was also a sense of solidarity in the courtroom, a shared determination to see justice served. Muhammad's defense team attempted to argue his innocence, claiming the evidence was circumstantial and that Malvo's statements were coerced. But their arguments struggled to hold up against the mountain of evidence presented. Malvo, now 17 and facing his own trial, offered no such defense. He admitted his role in the attacks, expressing regret and describing how Muhammad had orchestrated everything. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted to Muhammad's motivations. Prosecutors presented a chilling theory. The shootings were not random acts of violence, but part of a larger, deeply sinister plan. Muhammad had intended to extort money from the government, using the killings to leverage his demands. His ultimate goal, according to Malvo, was to create a training camp where he could indoctrinate others and spread his ideology. The vision was as twisted as it was ambitious, and it left the courtroom stunned. Forensic psychologists were called to provide insight into Muhammad's mindset. They described him as a man consumed by anger and delusions of grandeur, someone who believed he could reshape the world through violence. Malvo, by contrast, was portrayed as a victim of Muhammad's influence, a young man whose vulnerabilities had been exploited by a manipulative mentor. The contrast between the two highlighted the complexity of their relationship and the tragedy of Malvo's involvement. The jury's deliberation was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was inevitable. John Allen Muhammad was found guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced him to the most severe punishment allowed by law. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a sense of closure, though it could never undo the pain they had endured. Lee Boyd Malvo's trial followed a different path. Given his age and the influence Muhammad had exerted over him, his legal team argued for leniency. Malvo, was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. His case sparked widespread debate about the role of manipulation and accountability, raising questions about how the justice system should handle young offenders drawn into acts of violence by older, more experienced criminals. In the aftermath of the trials, the region began the slow process of healing. Communities came together to honor the lives lost, holding vigils and erecting memorials at the sites of the shootings. Schools implemented new safety measures, and public spaces underwent changes designed to restore a sense of security. The scars of the tragedy remained, but so did the resilience of those who had endured it. The case of the DC snipers left an indelible mark on the nation. It exposed vulnerabilities in the ways we think about public safety and raised difficult questions about the nature of evil and the factors that drive people to commit unimaginable acts. But it also highlighted the strength of a community united in the face of fear and the tireless dedication of law enforcement officers determined to bring justice. As the years passed, the story of Muhammad and Malvo became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the damage that can be wrought by manipulation, anger, and delusion. For those who lived through it, the memory of that dark October would never fade. But in the end, the killers were caught, the violence was stopped, and the community, though forever changed, found a way to move forward. The next story is called The Grim Sleeper. On the night of August 10, 1985, the quiet streets of South Los Angeles felt heavy with an eerie stillness. For some, it was just another hot summer evening. But for 29-year-old Deborah Jackson, the night was far from ordinary. It would mark her final hours. Deborah had spent the day visiting friends and running errands, her life weaving through the same threads of normalcy that held her neighborhood together. But as darkness settled, she began the journey home, unaware that someone was watching her. A predator lurked in the shadows, silent and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That predator was Lonnie Franklin Jr., though no one knew his name yet. To the world, he was invisible, a ghost blending seamlessly into the fabric of the community. Somewhere along her route, Deborah disappeared. Hours later, her body was found slumped in an alley. The discovery was brutal. She bore the signs of a life taken with cold precision. She'd been targeted, her life extinguished by someone who seemed to vanish into thin air. The police arrived at the scene, their flashlights casting stark beams of light on a crime that defied easy answers. To the seasoned detectives, it was clear, this wasn't random. Whoever had done this had done it before, or would again. As investigators combed through the sparse evidence, they uncovered troubling patterns. The manner of Deborah's passing suggested the work of someone who reveled in control, someone meticulous and ruthless. Yet, despite their efforts, the trail went cold almost immediately. This was South Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, a time when the city was grappling with a surge of violence and a strained police force, spread too thin to give every case the attention it deserved. Deborah's story risked becoming another unsolved mystery. But Lonnie Franklin wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Over the next year, the quiet predator continued his reign of terror. Women, many from vulnerable backgrounds, began vanishing. Some were found days later in alleys or dumpsters, their lives extinguished in similarly cruel and calculated ways. The community buzzed with fear. Rumors swirled about a serial predator targeting women, but without concrete evidence or an identifiable pattern, law enforcement hesitated to connect the dots. Then, in 1986, another woman went missing. Her name was Henrietta Wright, and her story mirrored Deborah's in haunting detail. Henrietta, a vibrant woman in her early 30s, had her own struggles but was fiercely loved by those who knew her. She was last seen alive on a quiet summer evening, walking near her neighborhood. Days later, her body was discovered in another unassuming alley, marked by the same clinical detachment. By this point, it was undeniable. South Los Angeles had a predator in its midst, someone who operated with terrifying efficiency. But this wasn't just about the methodical way these lives were taken. It was about the absence of clues. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no identifiable vehicle. Lonnie Franklin seemed to vanish into thin air after each horrific act. It was as if he wore the city itself as a mask, using its sprawling chaos as cover. The police, now desperate for leads, turned to the community for help. Flyers were posted, Pleas for witnesses broadcasted on local news. But Lonnie was a ghost, polite, unassuming, and entirely unsuspected. He lived among his neighbors, blending so seamlessly that even those closest to him couldn't have guessed the darkness he carried. He was the man who helped fix your car, the guy you'd chat with over a barbecue. To those who knew him, Lonnie Franklin was ordinary, and that ordinariness was his greatest weapon. Meanwhile, the victims kept coming. In 1987, the body of Barbara Ware was found in a similar fashion. The pattern had become undeniable. But it wasn't just the frequency of the crimes, it was the boldness. Whoever was behind these acts wasn't slowing down. Each crime was a statement, a chilling proclamation that he wasn't afraid of being caught. The media began to take notice, dubbing the unknown predator the Grim Sleeper years later, a name that would become synonymous with fear and horror. But for now, he remained nameless, faceless, a phantom lurking in the night. The police worked tirelessly, but resources were limited, and the sheer volume of cases in South Los Angeles meant that even the most horrifying crimes risked being buried in bureaucracy. For Lonnie, this chaos was a gift. He thrived in the shadows, exploiting every crack in the system to continue his dark crusade. But what made Lonnie truly terrifying wasn't just his ability to evade capture, it was his patience. Months could pass between attacks, even years. Each time, he'd lay low, letting the community's fear simmer down before striking again. And when he struck, it was with the same cold precision, leaving no trail, no sign of his existence except the grief he left behind. This was only the beginning. What lay ahead would push investigators, families, and an entire city to its breaking point. But in the summer of 1985, no one could have imagined the true extent of Lonnie Franklin's darkness. For now, he was a shadow, a whisper of fear in the night. But as the years unfolded, his name would become infamous, etched into the darkest chapters of Los Angeles history. The summer heat of 1986 brought no relief to South Los Angeles. Days blurred into nights as the city struggled with mounting tensions, a backdrop of unease that now carried an unspoken fear. Women were disappearing, and though few dared to say it aloud, the whispers grew louder. Someone was hunting in the shadows. By the time Henrietta Wright's body was discovered that summer, law enforcement knew they weren't dealing with isolated incidents. Her life had been cut short, in the same manner as Deborah Jackson's. The patterns were undeniable, and the lack of leads was maddening. Evidence at the scene was sparse, a grim testament to the methodical nature of the person responsible. Investigators searched desperately for connections, poring over case files, retracing victims' final steps. But every lead ended the same way, in silence. In October 1986, the pattern repeated. This time, the victim was Mary Lowe. Her family described her as a kind, spirited woman, someone who lit up the room wherever she went. Like the others, she vanished seemingly without a trace, her life stolen in an act that was as deliberate as it was unthinkable. And like the others, her body was left in an alley, a quiet, forgotten place that seemed to mock the idea of justice. The community grew restless. People locked their doors earlier, avoided walking alone, and scanned the faces of strangers with suspicion. Women who lived on the margins of society, those struggling with poverty, substance use, or homelessness, were especially vulnerable. They became easy targets, their disappearances often overlooked or dismissed. But within the fear, there was also frustration. Why wasn't the police doing more? Why hadn't this person been stopped? Behind the scenes, detectives were working tirelessly, though progress was excruciatingly slow. The lack of forensic technology at the time meant investigators were often left piecing together fragmented witness accounts and circumstantial evidence. Meanwhile, Lonnie Franklin moved unnoticed among the very people searching for him. He was, after all, just another neighbor, another familiar face in the crowd. He held barbecues, cracked jokes, and maintained an aura of trustworthiness that masked the predator beneath. But Lonnie's confidence was growing. By 1987, his attacks had become more frequent, his actions more brazen. In January of that year, the body of Barbara Ware was discovered. Her life had been stolen in a manner disturbingly similar to those who came before her. For detectives, it was another devastating blow. Despite their growing certainty that a single individual was responsible, they were no closer to identifying him. And for the community, the discovery was another grim reminder of the lurking danger. One detail stood out in Barbara's case: a call placed to the police from an unidentified man reporting the location of her body. His voice was calm, almost emotionless, as he gave directions to the alley where she'd been left. The call, chilling in its detachment, gave police their first real clue. But even this lead turned into a dead end. The voice couldn't be identified, and no other evidence tied it directly to the crimes. It was as if Lonnie was playing a game, staying just out of reach while leaving breadcrumbs that led nowhere. Then came Bernita Sparks. Her disappearance in April 1987 marked yet another escalation in Lonnie's string of crimes. Her family, desperate for answers, pleaded for the public's help. But her story ended the same way as the others. Her body, found days later, abandoned in an area that underscored the cruelty of her final moments. For her loved ones, the pain was unbearable. For investigators, it was another devastating blow, another reminder of how elusive this predator had become. The press began to take notice. Local newspapers and TV stations ran stories highlighting the troubling pattern, though the term serial wasn't yet used openly. The pressure on law enforcement mounted as the public demanded answers. But without tangible evidence or witnesses willing to come forward, the case remained at a standstill. Lonnie, meanwhile, watched it all unfold with unnerving calm. He knew the chaos surrounding his crimes worked in his favor. The sheer volume of violence in South Los Angeles made it easy for his actions to blend into the noise. He thrived in this environment, exploiting every weakness in the system to continue his reign unchecked. But even as he evaded capture, Lonnie began to show signs of arrogance. His attacks grew riskier, his confidence in his own invisibility reaching dangerous levels. He believed he was untouchable, and for a time, he was right. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Advances in forensic science were on the horizon, and while Lonnie couldn't have known it, his carefully constructed facade wouldn't hold forever. For now, though, he remained a ghost, a predator hiding in plain sight, waiting for his next opportunity. The city, haunted by his actions, braced itself for what would come next, even as it remained blind to the man behind the mask. The years following the relentless series of tragedies brought a strange and disquieting calm to South Los Angeles. After 1988, the disappearances and grim discoveries seemed to slow, almost as if the predator had vanished into thin air. For some, it felt like the nightmare might finally be over. But for others, those who had lost daughters, sisters, and mothers, the silence was unbearable. It wasn't peace. It was a void, a chilling absence that carried the weight of unresolved terror. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to comb through case files, desperate to piece together a pattern that might point to a suspect. The name Grim Sleeper hadn't yet entered public consciousness, but those who worked on the cases knew they were dealing with someone who had mastered the art of disappearing. Leads dried up, resources were reallocated, and the unsolved cases began to gather dust. Yet, somewhere in the city, the man responsible for so much pain had simply stepped back into the shadows, biding his time. Lonnie Franklin was living two lives, as he had always done. To his neighbors, he was a helpful and friendly presence, always ready to lend a hand or share a laugh. He repaired cars, attended community gatherings, and maintained the kind of mundane routine that allowed him to blend in effortlessly. But the darkness within him hadn't gone away. It simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge again. It's impossible to say exactly why Lonnie paused his horrific spree. Some criminologists suggest that even the most calculating predators can retreat after a period of intense activity, either out of fear of being caught or a need to reset. Others believe that life circumstances, family obligations, health issues, or a desire to avoid detection can play a role. For Lonnie, it might have been all of these things, or it might have been something else entirely. What is certain is that his pause was not permanent. During this so-called quiet period, Lonnie remained close to the very community he had terrorized. He worked odd jobs and continued his role as the neighborhood mechanic, often earning praise for his reliability. But there were glimpses of the man behind the mask. Those who knew him well noted a disturbing edge to his personality, a tendency to snap over minor inconveniences. He could be charming one moment and cold the next. Still, These moments were fleeting, easily dismissed as quirks rather than red flags. What Lonnie couldn't have anticipated was the way technology was beginning to catch up to him. By the late 1990s, advancements in forensic science were revolutionizing how investigators approached cold cases. DNA profiling, once an emerging technology, was now a powerful tool. Evidence that had been collected years earlier, but deemed inconclusive, was being re-examined under a new lens. The walls around Lonnie's carefully constructed facade were starting to shift, though he remained oblivious. By 2002, the eerie calm had begun to crack. Another woman disappeared, her story bearing the same chilling hallmarks as those before her. Her body was found days later, left in a secluded area as if discarded without a second thought. The return of such a familiar pattern sent shock waves through the investigative teams still haunted by the earlier cases. Could it be the same person? Had the predator from years ago returned? Or was this someone else entirely? For Lonnie, the thrill of evading capture was intoxicating. He had spent over a decade living in relative obscurity, watching as the world moved on from the horrors he had inflicted. Now, emboldened by the passage of time, he began to strike again. The victims who fell into his web during this period were often women overlooked by society, their stories quietly erased even before they had a chance to be told. But their disappearances left behind echoes, ripples that would eventually collide with the growing momentum of forensic breakthroughs. As the cases from the 1980s were revisited with fresh eyes, patterns emerged that hadn't been clear before. Victims were connected not just by the circumstances of their disappearances, but by the chilling efficiency of the predator who had targeted them. This was someone who knew how to avoid leaving evidence, someone who understood how to manipulate the chaos of the city to his advantage. But even the most careful plans leave cracks, and Lonnie's were beginning to show. The return of the predator reignited a sense of urgency among investigators. They began looking for links, not just between the past and present cases, but also within the fabric of the community itself. Who had been there all along? Who had lived in the shadows, quietly blending in while carrying out unspeakable acts? Lonnie remained confident, even as the net around him began to tighten. He had survived decades without detection, outlasting shifts in police leadership, changes in technology, and the fleeting attention of the media. But the predator who had once thrived in obscurity was now operating in a world where secrets were harder to keep, and the past was not so easily buried. The quiet streets of South Los Angeles were no longer silent. Investigators were asking questions, connecting dots, and closing in on a truth that had eluded them for far too long. And though Lonnie Franklin couldn't have known it, his carefully crafted double life was about to unravel. The shadow he had lived in for so long was about to be pierced by a light he couldn't escape. In the early 2000s, the city of Los Angeles was changing. Advances in technology brought a new level of hope for unsolved cases, while neighborhoods long overshadowed by violence began to see glimmers of revival. Yet, for some, the wounds of the past refused to heal. Families of women, whose lives had been stolen years earlier, still waited for answers. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these evolving streets, Lonnie Franklin resumed his dark pattern, slipping seamlessly back into a world that had yet to unmask him. The quiet return of violence wasn't immediately noticed. Victims disappeared one by one, their lives extinguished and their stories left untold. It wasn't until 2002, when the body of Princess Bertha Mew was discovered in an alleyway in Inglewood, that the chilling echoes of the past began to resonate once more. Her story bore the same marks: abrupt disappearance, tragic end, and a chilling absence of evidence. For investigators who had long worked these cases, it felt like a nightmare stirring back to life. Princess' case was eerily familiar. Her life had been marked by struggles, but she was known for her resilience and warmth. She had a family who loved her, a community who wanted answers. Her loss was more than a statistic. It was a tragedy that reignited the lingering question: was the same predator from the 1980s back? Detectives found themselves grappling with a bitter truth. In the years since the earlier cases, advances in forensic science had promised breakthroughs, yet the practical application of these tools often lagged. Evidence from decades-old cases sat in backlogged labs, untested and waiting for the resources to be processed. It was in this bureaucratic delay that Lonnie thrived. He knew the city's limitations better than anyone, and he exploited them with chilling precision. In 2003, another woman, Valerie McCorvey, was found in circumstances strikingly similar to the others. Valerie, a devoted mother and a kind spirit, had disappeared while running errands. Her loved ones, devastated by her loss, sought answers that felt perpetually out of reach. For the detectives, the case reinforced a terrifying realization. Their predator hadn't simply returned, he had evolved. Lonnie had spent years perfecting his method. He understood how to navigate the city's chaos, choosing locations that shielded his actions from prying eyes. He targeted women who were often marginalized, those whose absences might not immediately raise alarm. But what set him apart wasn't just his cunning, it was his patience. Lonnie waited for the moments when attention waned, striking with a cold precision that left investigators scrambling for clues. By 2005, the pressure on law enforcement had reached a breaking point. A growing backlog of unsolved cases, coupled with the emergence of new victims, forced the department to revisit the evidence they'd long struggled to piece together. The advances in DNA profiling now offered hope where there had once been none. Samples collected from victims in the 1980s were being re-examined, their secrets finally accessible through technology that didn't exist at the time. What investigators couldn't have known was how close they were to identifying their predator. As the years passed, the pattern continued. Janisha Peters, a young woman with dreams of building a better future, was discovered in January 2007. Her life, filled with promise, was cut short in the same methodical manner. Her family's grief echoed the heartbreak of those who had come before, a collective pain that demanded justice. What investigators began to piece together in these years was staggering. The DNA evidence from Janisha's case matched samples collected from earlier victims, creating an undeniable link between the crimes. But identifying a pattern was only half the battle. The DNA didn't match any known offenders in the database. Whoever was responsible had never been caught for any crime that required a sample. This was someone who had eluded the system entirely, a phantom who existed outside its grasp. Yet, the walls were beginning to close in. Investigators turned their attention to familial DNA testing, a groundbreaking technique that could identify close relatives of an unknown suspect. It was a shot in the dark, a last-ditch effort to find the person behind the pattern of devastation. As the evidence mounted, Lonnie Franklin continued his routine. He walked the same streets, worked the same jobs, and mingled with the same people who unknowingly lived in the presence of a predator. But the meticulous mask he wore was beginning to crack. For decades, he had operated without fear of consequence. Now, the advances in science, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the tireless efforts of those determined to bring closure were finally converging. The city that had once provided him a veil of anonymity was now his undoing. The DNA evidence that had quietly waited in storage for years was speaking louder than ever, pointing to a predator who believed himself untouchable. Investigators were closer than they had ever been, their determination fueled by the faces of the women who had been taken. And though Lonnie Franklin moved through the streets with the same air of invisibility, the weight of his actions was catching up. The cracks in his facade were growing wider, and the shadow he had hidden in for so long was beginning to crumble under the light of justice. The breakthrough came in 2010, years after Lonnie Franklin had resumed his dark pattern. By this point, the collective efforts of investigators, forensic scientists, and relentless families had pushed the case to the edge of resolution. It began with a bold, innovative move, a decision to use familial DNA to identify the predator who had haunted South Los Angeles for decades. The familial DNA approach was a relatively new method at the time, one that relied on finding close genetic relatives of an unknown individual. In the case of the crimes linked to the Grim Sleeper, investigators had DNA samples from multiple victims, but no match in any criminal database. The hope was that this advanced technology could finally give them a lead. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. In early 2010, the lab returned a result, a partial match. The DNA didn't belong to the suspect himself, but to a close relative. The name tied to the sample was Christopher Franklin, Lonnie Franklin's son. Christopher had been arrested years earlier for an unrelated offense, and during that process, his DNA had been entered into the system. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to send a jolt through the investigative team. Detectives began to zero in on Lonnie Franklin. Everything about him lined up: his age, his location during the years of the attacks, and his unassuming presence in the community. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence. They needed DNA directly from him to confirm the match. And they couldn't just walk up and ask. Instead, they turned to a tactic as meticulous as Lonnie's crimes had been. They surveilled him, watching his every move, waiting for the moment he discarded something that could hold his DNA. A cup, a napkin, anything. For weeks, detectives followed him, their patience mirroring the very patience that Lonnie had exercised in his attacks. The opportunity finally came at a pizza restaurant. Lonnie had finished his meal, tossing his trash into a public bin as he left. Unbeknownst to him, detectives swooped in moments later, retrieving the discarded items. It was enough. The DNA was tested and the results came back unmistakable. The samples collected from decades of crime scenes matched Lonnie Franklin's DNA. After years of tormenting a city and eluding capture, the predator was finally exposed. On July 7, 2010, the arrest was made. Detectives arrived at Lonnie's modest home, a house he had lived in for decades, surrounded by neighbors who had never suspected the monster in their midst. The arrest itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic for the gravity of the crimes he had committed. But inside Lonnie's home, investigators found a chilling trove of evidence that spoke louder than any words ever could. The garage became a treasure trove of horrors. Photos, hundreds of them, showed women in various states of distress, some of whom had never been reported missing. It was a harrowing reminder of how many lives Lonnie had touched with his darkness, how many families might never know the full story of what had happened to their loved ones. There were items of clothing, personal effects, and other keepsakes that pointed to the calculated nature of his actions. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the man who had hidden in plain sight for so long. Neighbors were stunned. Lonnie had been a fixture in the community, someone people trusted to fix their cars or offer a friendly wave as they passed by. But the veneer of normalcy had masked something far darker. Those who had interacted with him now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the predator who had stolen so many lives. As Lonnie was taken into custody, the weight of the moment settled over South Los Angeles. For decades, his actions had gone unchecked, his crimes hidden beneath the chaos of a city struggling to keep pace with its own challenges. But now, the predator who had thrived in obscurity was being forced into the light, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. Yet, for the families of his victims, the arrest was only the beginning of a long journey toward understanding and closure. The walls of Lonnie Franklin's carefully constructed life had finally crumbled, exposing the darkness he had harbored for so long. The man who had walked so freely among his neighbors, confident in his ability to evade justice, was now facing the weight of his actions. And while his capture brought relief, it also left behind a haunting legacy, a reminder of the lives he had taken and the pain he had caused. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that comes when anticipation hangs in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Lonnie Franklin sat at the defendant's table, his expression unreadable. The man who had evaded justice for decades, living a double life with meticulous precision, was now face to face with the consequences of his actions. Across from him sat the families of the women whose lives had been taken. Their faces were etched with pain, anger, and determination. This wasn't just a trial, it was a reckoning. The evidence against Lonnie was overwhelming. The DNA, collected from multiple victims over the years, formed the backbone of the case. Each match told a story, linking him directly to the lives that had been stolen. But it wasn't just the science that painted a damning picture. The photographs found in his home, the personal effects belonging to women who had vanished, and the meticulous manner in which he had hidden his secrets all pointed to one inescapable truth. Lonnie Franklin was the predator who had haunted South Los Angeles for decades. Prosecutors presented their case with cold precision. They spoke of the patterns, how Lonnie had selected his victims, women who were often vulnerable and overlooked by society. They described the calculated way he had carried out his crimes, leaving little evidence behind but the lasting scars on the community. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the narrative, a chilling portrait of a man who had operated in the shadows for far too long. Survivors and family members took the stand, their voices steady but filled with emotion. They spoke of the women who had been taken, their laughter, their dreams, the lives they were building before they were so cruelly cut short. For many, this was the first time their stories had been fully heard. The courtroom became a space where their voices, silenced for so long, finally carried the weight they deserved. Lonnie's defense team tried to challenge the narrative, raising questions about procedural issues and the reliability of decades-old evidence. They pointed to the gaps in the investigation, arguing that the case against him relied too heavily on circumstantial connections. But the DNA was irrefutable, a scientific certainty that tied him to the crimes in a way no argument could dismantle. And beyond the DNA, there was the sheer volume of evidence, the photos, the items linked to the victims, and the stories that aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. As the trial unfolded, the community watched closely. The man they had once called a neighbor, a friend, or even a mentor was now revealed to be something entirely different. The weight of his crimes was staggering, and the trial became not just a search for justice, but a means of understanding how someone could carry out such acts while maintaining a facade of normalcy. Lonnie's demeanor throughout the trial was unnerving. He rarely showed emotion, his face a mask of indifference that only deepened the anguish of those who had come seeking answers. To the families of his victims, this lack of remorse felt like another wound, a reminder of the calculated cruelty that had defined his actions. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. They recounted the lives lost, the evidence that tied Lonnie to each one, and the years of fear and uncertainty he had inflicted on the community. They spoke of justice, not as revenge, but as a necessary acknowledgement of the harm done and the lives forever altered. When the jury delivered its verdict, the weight of the moment was palpable. Lonnie Franklin was found guilty on all counts, a decision that brought a measure of closure to the families and survivors who had waited so long for this day. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that no verdict could bring back what had been lost. The lives taken, the dreams extinguished, and the pain endured would remain a permanent scar on the city's history. As Lonnie was led away, his expression remained unchanged. For the man who had operated so carefully, so deliberately, the end was quiet and unceremonious. But for the families, for the community, and for the investigators who had fought tirelessly to bring him to justice, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that even the most elusive predators cannot hide forever. Yet, even as the trial ended, questions lingered. How many more victims were there, women whose names might never be known? How many families were left searching for answers that might never come? And how had Lonnie managed to evade justice for so long, his actions hidden beneath the surface of everyday life? These questions would continue to haunt those connected to the case, even as they worked to move forward. For South Los Angeles, the trial marked the end of a decades-long nightmare. But the legacy of Lonnie Franklin's actions would remain, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. As Lonnie Franklin settled into his life behind bars, the weight of his crimes continued to ripple outward. The courtroom verdict might have marked the end of his reign, but for those left behind, families, survivors, and a community forever changed, the journey toward healing was only just beginning. Each name tied to his actions carried a story, and those stories refused to fade, etched into the memories of loved ones and the streets of South Los Angeles. Investigators, even after the trial, didn't stop working. Lonnie's conviction was tied to the known victims, but the evidence discovered in his home suggested there were more, possibly many more, whose fates remained unknown. Hundreds of photographs, meticulously kept, depicted women in vulnerable moments, some of whom had never been reported missing. These images became a haunting testament to the scope of his actions, raising chilling questions about the true extent of his crimes. Efforts to identify the women in these photographs became a priority. Task forces were assembled, and images were shared with the public in a delicate effort to connect these faces to names and stories. Families came forward, some with answers they had dreaded for years, others still left in the agony of uncertainty. The painstaking process underscored a devastating truth. Lonnie's actions had stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined, touching lives in ways that might never be fully understood. For the families of those whose lives had been taken, the conviction provided a bittersweet kind of closure. They had waited years, sometimes decades, for justice, and now they finally had it. Yet, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that no sentence could undo the pain or bring back their loved ones. They clung to memories, photographs, and the small pieces of their lives that remained, determined to keep their loved ones' legacies alive. Community leaders in South Los Angeles began to confront the deeper issues that had allowed Lonnie Franklin to operate unchecked for so long. Many pointed to systemic failures, overburdened law enforcement, a lack of resources for vulnerable communities, and societal indifference to women who were often overlooked. These conversations sparked a broader reckoning, pushing for reforms to prevent something like this from happening again. At the same time, Lonnie's case brought attention to the power of DNA technology and the potential it held for solving other cold cases. Across the country, law enforcement agencies began re-examining evidence from decades-old crimes, applying new tools that hadn't existed at the time. In some ways, the legacy of the investigation into Lonnie Franklin's crimes extended far beyond his conviction, shaping how future cases would be approached. But for all the advancements and conversations sparked by his capture, Lonnie Franklin himself remained an enigma. He rarely spoke about his crimes, offering little insight into the motivations behind his actions. Psychologists, criminologists, and investigators debated endlessly about what drove him. Was it a deep-seated need for control, a distorted sense of power, or something even darker, buried so deeply within him that it defied explanation? For his neighbors, the revelation of his crimes continued to resonate. Lonnie had lived among them for decades, a familiar figure in a community that had no idea of the darkness he carried. The betrayal was profound, a reminder of how easily appearances could deceive. People who had once trusted him now grappled with the knowledge that they had unknowingly shared their lives with someone capable of such unspeakable acts. As the years passed, the stories of Lonnie Franklin's victims remained a focal point, their lives honored in memorials and gatherings that sought to reclaim their narratives. They were no longer just names in a case file or faces in a photograph. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives had meaning, whose memories would not be overshadowed by the man who had taken them away. Lonnie Franklin's own life came to an end in 2020 when he was found unresponsive in his prison cell. Official reports stated there was no immediate sign of wrongdoing, and his death was ruled as natural causes. The news brought a strange finality to his story, but it also reignited the pain for many who had hoped for answers he never gave. In his silence, he left behind unanswered questions, fragments of stories that might never be completed. Even in death, the shadow Lonnie Franklin cast over South Los Angeles remained. His actions were a stark reminder of how darkness can exist in plain sight, hidden behind the most ordinary of facades. But his capture and conviction also served as a testament to perseverance, the relentless pursuit of justice by investigators, the unwavering courage of survivors, and the enduring strength of a community determined to heal. The legacy of Lonnie Franklin is not just one of devastation, but of resilience. It is a reminder of the lives lost, the lessons learned, and the unyielding resolve to shine a light on the darkness, ensuring that those who were taken are never forgotten. The next and final story is called The Phoenix Shooter. On a warm spring evening in March 2015, the city of Phoenix buzzed with its usual energy. The streets were alive with the hum of traffic, conversations spilling out of cafes, and the occasional bark of a dog as the desert sun dipped below the horizon. For most, it was just another ordinary night. But for a young woman named Carla, it was the night her world would change forever. Carla had spent her evening visiting a friend in Maryvale, a neighborhood known for its tight-knit community and unassuming charm. As she walked home, her mind wandered. The streets were quiet, with only the faint sound of crickets filling the air. She didn't notice the car creeping slowly behind her. Its headlights were off, its engine barely audible, a predator stalking in the shadows. The first sign of danger came too late. A sharp noise cracked through the stillness, startling Carla. She didn't realize what had happened until a searing pain shot through her side. Her legs buckled and she collapsed onto the pavement. The car sped away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind only silence and the faint sound of her shallow breathing. Carla survived, but the incident left her shaken and confused. She told investigators she hadn't seen the shooter, only the flash of a dark vehicle as it sped away. Her account painted a chilling picture. This wasn't a robbery or an argument gone wrong. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had targeted her, and they had done so without hesitation. For the Phoenix Police Department, Carla's case was troubling, but not unprecedented. The city had seen its share of violence, and random acts of aggression weren't uncommon. Yet, there was something about this attack that felt different. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the true scope of the danger became horrifyingly clear. In early April, another incident rocked the same neighborhood. A young man named Diego was sitting in his car outside a friend's house, scrolling through his phone, when a vehicle pulled up beside him. Before he could react, shots rang out. The windows of his car shattered, and Diego slumped forward, the phone slipping from his hand. The shooter sped away, leaving the scene eerily similar to Carla's attack, fast, silent, and without warning. Diego didn't survive. His family, devastated by the loss, struggled to make sense of what had happened. He had no known enemies, no involvement in anything that would make him a target. To those who knew him, Diego's life was full of promise, now tragically cut short by a faceless predator. The police began connecting dots. 2 shootings in the same area, both seemingly random and without a clear motive. Detectives reviewed security footage from nearby cameras, but the images were grainy, the details too blurred to provide any meaningful leads. Witnesses described a dark car, possibly a sedan, but the specifics varied. The lack of evidence was frustrating, and the fear in the community began to grow. Over the next few weeks, more incidents followed. Each time, the pattern was the same. A lone individual, caught off guard, targeted by a shooter who disappeared without a trace. The randomness of the attacks made them even more terrifying. There was no way to predict who might be next. The victims varied in age, gender, and background. The only common thread was the neighborhood and the eerie precision of the shooter. By May, the media had picked up the story. Headlines warned of a possible serial shooter in Phoenix, and the public was on edge. Parents walked their children to school, keeping a wary eye on passing cars. Street corners once bustling with activity grew quieter as people avoided going out alone after dark. The Maryvale neighborhood, once a vibrant community, now lived in the shadow of fear. Detectives worked tirelessly, combing through reports, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing ballistics. The bullets recovered from the scenes pointed to the same weapon, confirming that the attacks were connected. Yet, the shooter remained elusive. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no clear motive. It was as if the perpetrator thrived on the chaos, using the city's sprawling streets and countless alleyways as their hunting ground. The unpredictability of the attacks weighed heavily on the residents of Phoenix. Every unfamiliar car became a potential threat, every shadow a reminder of the danger lurking just out of sight. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and speculation. Some believed the shooter was targeting specific individuals, while others thought the attacks were completely random, a terrifying game played by someone who reveled in their own anonymity. For Carla, the survivor of the first attack, the memories were impossible to escape. She replayed that night over and over, searching for anything she might have missed, a face, a license plate, a detail that could help bring her attacker to justice. But there was nothing. Just the flash of a car, and the sound of tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. The summer of 2015 brought no relief. The attacks continued sporadically, each one spreading more panic and confusion. The shooter's ability to strike without leaving a trace baffled law enforcement. Profilers speculated about the kind of person who could carry out such acts. Someone calculated, methodical, and completely devoid of empathy. Yet, despite the growing body of evidence, the shooter remained a ghost. The city of Phoenix, now held captive by fear, waited anxiously for answers that seemed just out of reach. Detectives worked around the clock, knowing that every passing day without a breakthrough brought the shooter closer to their next target. The only question was when, and where, they would strike again. The attacks didn't stop. As the summer of 2015 stretched on, the streets of Maryvale and surrounding neighborhoods grew quieter, not from peace, but from fear. Residents altered their routines, avoiding being outside alone at night. Parents double-checked locks on doors and windows. Yet, for all their caution, the sense of vulnerability remained. The shooter had no pattern that could be predicted, no target that could be anticipated. Anyone could be next. On a humid July evening, a young mother named Elizabeth was on her way home after a long shift at work. She had just stopped at a convenience store to pick up milk for her son when the sound of tires screeching behind her made her turn instinctively. A dark sedan had pulled into the parking lot at an odd angle, its headlights off despite the late hour. Elizabeth hesitated, her instincts prickling. But, before she could act, a series of loud cracks echoed in the air. Elizabeth dropped to the ground, clutching her arm, which had been grazed by one of the projectiles. Chaos erupted as bystanders scrambled for cover, shouting for someone to call for help. The car sped off, leaving nothing behind but the lingering smell of burnt rubber and the trail of fear it carried. Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, her injury non-life-threatening, but her trauma deep. She became yet another name on the growing list of victims, another reminder that no one was safe. The Phoenix Police Department ramped up their efforts. A task force was formed specifically to investigate the string of attacks, pooling resources and expertise in a desperate attempt to catch the shooter. Analysts pored over maps of the city, charting the locations of each incident in the hope of uncovering a pattern. Ballistics experts matched the rounds used in the shootings, confirming once again that the same weapon had been used. But even with these connections, the shooter remained elusive, their identity hidden in the sprawling expanse of Phoenix's streets. Meanwhile, the community's unease turned into anger. Residents demanded answers, holding town hall meetings and organizing neighborhood watch groups. Local news channels ran nightly updates, their broadcasts filled with stories of victims and pleas for information. The police assured the public they were doing everything possible, but the mounting pressure only highlighted their lack of progress. For every step forward, the shooter seemed to slip further into the shadows. Then came the attack that shifted everything. It was a quiet evening in mid-August when a 19-year-old named Miguel was walking home from his girlfriend's house. He had just texted her to say he'd made it halfway there when he noticed a car trailing him at a distance. It wasn't uncommon for cars to slow down in his neighborhood, but something about the way this one moved felt off. He picked up his pace, his heart racing, but the car accelerated too. Without warning, a burst of sound erupted behind him. Miguel felt a sharp pain in his leg and collapsed to the ground, clutching the wound as the car sped off. Unlike the earlier incidents, this one was witnessed by a neighbor who had been sitting on their porch. They saw the dark sedan and managed to catch a partial license plate before the vehicle disappeared around the corner. It wasn't much, but it was the first real lead investigators had. With this new information, the task force shifted its focus. They cross-referenced the partial plate against records of registered vehicles in the area, narrowing down possibilities. Surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras was pulled and scrutinized frame by frame. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the shooter was still out there, and the attack showed no signs of stopping. In September, the shooter struck again, this time targeting a couple parked in their driveway after a night out. The sudden ambush left the man injured, and the woman shaken but alive. Investigators arrived at the scene within minutes, canvassing the area for witnesses and evidence. They found shell casings that matched the previous attacks and interviewed a neighbor who claimed to have seen a vehicle speeding away. Once again, it was a dark sedan, the now infamous hallmark of the elusive shooter. Despite the increased police presence, the shooter's ability to strike and vanish seemed almost otherworldly. It wasn't just their precision or the randomness of their targets. It was the way they seemed to blend into the fabric of the city, becoming invisible the moment the deed was done. Some speculated the shooter might be someone with a deep knowledge of the area, perhaps even a local. Others wondered if it was someone who thrived on the chaos, deliberately spreading fear without rhyme or reason. For the residents of Maryvale and beyond, the sense of unease became a constant companion. Every dark car passing by, every unfamiliar face, every echo of a loud noise became a potential threat. The shooter wasn't just taking lives, they were holding an entire community hostage. Their presence felt even when they weren't there. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together witness accounts, analyzing ballistics, and combing through hours of footage. But the shooter was methodical, their movements calculated to avoid detection. Each lead brought a flicker of hope, only to be extinguished by the frustrating reality that the person behind the attacks remained free. And so, the summer turned into fall, the long hot days giving way to cooler evenings. But the heat of fear lingered in Phoenix, an oppressive weight that hung over the city. The shooter's motives remained a mystery, their identity a puzzle that refused to be solved. And as the days passed, the question on everyone's mind was the same: when would they strike next? The city of Phoenix braced itself for another attack, but the shooter seemed to vanish as fall stretched into winter. For weeks, there were no new reports of ambushes or cars stalking quiet streets. Residents began to breathe a cautious sigh of relief, though the fear never entirely disappeared. But the silence was not a sign of the danger passing. It was the calm before the storm. In early December 2015, the shooter re-emerged with chilling precision. This time, the target was a family returning home after a late dinner. As they pulled into their driveway, headlights from a car parked further down the street flicked on, cutting through the darkness. The vehicle began to creep toward them, slow and deliberate. The father, sensing something was off, urged his wife and children to get inside. But before they could react, a series of sharp cracks shattered the quiet night. The car sped off, leaving behind a scene of chaos and terror. Fortunately, no one in the family was seriously injured, though the car bore the scars of the encounter, windows shattered, dents riddling its side. For investigators, this attack marked a troubling escalation. The shooter wasn't just targeting individuals on foot or alone in their vehicles anymore. They were now attacking entire families, ramping up the unpredictability of their crimes. The task force redoubled its efforts. Detectives began to map out the attacks in greater detail, searching for patterns not just in location, but in time, weather, and even traffic condition. They scoured surveillance footage from nearby businesses and residential cameras, but the shooter was maddeningly elusive. The dark sedan appeared in blurry glimpses, never clear enough to provide a definitive make or model. It was as if the city itself conspired to keep their identity hidden. As the investigation deepened, a troubling realization emerged. The shooter had an uncanny ability to disappear. Witnesses described the attacks as swift and silent, with the car vanishing into side streets or alleyways almost immediately after the shots were fired. It was clear that this wasn't someone acting on impulse. The attacks were deliberate, each one meticulously planned to avoid detection. But what was driving them? What was the motivation behind such calculated acts of violence? Psychologists and profilers were brought in to help piece together a picture of the person behind the crimes. They theorized that the shooter was likely someone with a deep sense of control, someone who thrived on the power they wielded over their victims and the chaos they created in the community. This wasn't about personal vendettas or disputes. It was about dominance, about instilling fear and watching it spread. As the new year approached, the shooter struck again. This time, the victim was a middle-aged man named Ramon, who was walking home after finishing his shift at a local restaurant. Ramon had taken the same route for years, a quiet path through residential streets that cut his commute in half. But on this night, he never made it home. A neighbor heard the shots and called emergency services, but by the time help arrived, the dark sedan was gone and Ramon's life had been cut tragically short. His death sent another shockwave through the community, a grim reminder that the shooter was still out there, waiting for their next opportunity. Ramon's case provided investigators with another piece of the puzzle. Witnesses reported seeing the sedan again, though descriptions of its color and make remained inconsistent. Some said it was black, others swore it was dark gray or navy blue. The inconsistency was maddening, but the task force pressed on, determined to catch the person responsible. By now, the media had dubbed the unknown assailant the serial street shooter. The name carried a sense of dread, encapsulating the randomness and violence of their actions. News outlets ran nightly updates, showing maps of the attack sites and interviewing terrified residents. The public pressure on law enforcement grew, with many questioning why the shooter hadn't been caught despite the mounting evidence. Detectives began to focus on the shooter's ability to avoid detection. They theorized that the person likely had a detailed knowledge of the city's layout, its back roads, alleyways, and less traveled streets. This suggested someone local, someone who knew the area intimately. But narrowing down suspects in a city as vast as Phoenix was a Herculean task, and time was not on their side. In January 2016, a break came, though it was far from the breakthrough investigators needed. A witness from an earlier attack remembered a sticker on the back of the sedan, a small detail that hadn't come up in initial interviews. The information was promising, but it also raised questions. If the car had such a distinctive feature, why hadn't it been noticed earlier? Was the shooter switching vehicles or altering their appearance to throw off suspicion? The task force began to investigate registered vehicles with similar descriptions and unique features, cross-referencing them with known addresses in the areas of the attacks. It was a monumental effort, requiring hours of legwork and database searches. Meanwhile, the city remained on edge, the specter of the shooter looming over every quiet street and dimly lit parking lot. Each new attack added to the pressure, but it also brought the task force closer to the truth. The shooter's confidence was growing, their actions becoming bolder and more frequent. Yet, for all their planning and precision, they couldn't hide forever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and the city's patience was wearing thin. It was only a matter of time before the hunter became the hunted. The start of 2016 brought no relief for Phoenix. The attacks continued, each one more brazen than the last, as the shooter seemed to revel in the chaos they created. For residents, every dark sedan became a harbinger of danger, every sharp sound a potential sign of another strike. The fear was palpable, and the city's tension reached a breaking point. In mid-February, a young couple, Amanda and Louise, were parked outside Amanda's parents' home, chatting in the car after an evening out. The street was quiet, the kind of suburban calm that should have felt safe. But as Amanda leaned over to kiss Louise goodbye, the familiar crack of shots shattered the night. The first round hit the car's windshield, spraying shards of glass across the dashboard. Amanda screamed as Louise instinctively ducked, his arm shielding her as the shooter fired again. The attack lasted only seconds, the shooter disappearing down the street as quickly as they had arrived. When the police arrived, they found Amanda and Louis shaken but alive, their car riddled with bullet holes. It was another near miss, but the couple's story added more clues to the growing profile of the shooter. Amanda described the sedan in vivid detail, a dark blue vehicle with tinted windows and a faint scratch along the driver's side door. It wasn't much, but it was something. Investigators latched onto this new detail, cross-referencing it with the partial plate number collected months earlier. The task force's focus narrowed, targeting specific neighborhoods where vehicles matching the description were registered. Meanwhile, analysts scoured reports for any mention of similar cars seen in suspicious circumstances. Every thread was followed, every lead pursued, but the shooter remained just out of reach. As March rolled in, the shooter's actions took another chilling turn. This time, the attack wasn't in the familiar streets of Maryvale, but in a neighboring community. A 22-year-old named Erica was walking home from a late shift at a diner when the sedan appeared. The shooter fired from the passenger window, striking her before speeding away. Erica was found by a passerby who called for help, her injuries severe, but not fatal. She later described the attack to police, recalling the cold, detached way the car had approached and the lack of any warning before the shots were fired. The shift in location added a new layer of complexity to the case. Until now, the shooter had confined their attacks to a specific area, creating a pattern investigators could follow. But this new incident suggested the predator was expanding their territory, making it even harder to predict where they would strike next. The randomness of the locations, combined with the shooter's precision, created a terrifying new reality for Phoenix residents. No one was safe, no matter where they lived or worked. The task force, now under intense public scrutiny, worked around the clock. They conducted stakeouts in areas where the shooter was most likely to strike, using unmarked vehicles and plainclothes officers to blend in. Patrols were increased, with officers briefed on the shooter's methods and instructed to respond immediately to any suspicious activity. Despite their efforts, the shooter seemed to always be one step ahead, slipping through the cracks and striking where they were least expected. In late March, a critical moment came. During an evening patrol, an officer spotted a dark sedan parked suspiciously near a gas station in Maryvale. The vehicle matched the description provided by multiple witnesses, down to the faint scratch on the driver's side door. The officer approached cautiously, radioing for backup. But before help could arrive, the car's engine roared to life, and it sped away into the night. A high-speed chase ensued, the officer trailing the sedan through narrow streets and sharp turns. It was the closest law enforcement had come to capturing the shooter, and the task force held their breath as the pursuit unfolded. But just as quickly as it had started, the chase ended. The sedan darted into an alley and disappeared, leaving the officer with nothing but a fleeting glimpse of its taillights. The failed pursuit was a blow to the task force, but it wasn't without value. The encounter confirmed their suspect's vehicle and added weight to their theory that the shooter was someone familiar with the area, someone who knew exactly how to evade capture. Surveillance was ramped up even further, with officers focusing on the neighborhoods where the sedan had last been seen. Meanwhile, the media frenzy surrounding the case reached new heights. News outlets aired footage of the chase, speculating on the shooter's identity and motives. Psychologists offered insights into the predator's behavior, describing them as methodical and detached, someone who derived satisfaction from the fear they instilled. The public, already on edge, grew even more anxious as it became clear that the shooter wasn't just dangerous, they were enjoying the game. For Phoenix residents, the sense of normalcy was gone. Parents escorted their children everywhere, friends traveled in groups, and even the smallest errands were done with a heightened sense of awareness. The streets felt different, the city's usual hum of activity replaced by a pervasive tension. Each day without an attack brought relief, but it was always temporary. Everyone knew the silence wouldn't last. And they were right. Now, the shooter struck again in early April, this time targeting a lone jogger in a park just before dawn. The victim, a 34-year-old man named Brian, was shot twice in the back but managed to crawl to safety. His description of the attack echoed those before him: a dark sedan, its windows rolled down just enough for the shots to be fired, disappearing before he even had a chance to scream for help. The task force pored over the details, determined to catch the shooter before more lives were destroyed. They knew they were getting closer. The net was tightening, and the shooter's overconfidence might soon become their downfall. But for now, the predator still held the upper hand, their shadow stretching over a city desperate for answers. By late April 2016, the tension in Phoenix was unbearable. The shooter's spree had shaken the community to its core, and every new attack deepened the city's desperation for resolution. Law enforcement was running out of time and patience. The predator's pattern, once relatively contained, had grown increasingly erratic, making it nearly impossible to predict where or when they might strike next. But beneath the chaos, small pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The breakthrough started, as many do, with an ordinary moment that turned extraordinary. A young woman named Vanessa was at a convenience store late one evening, picking up snacks for a movie night with friends. She noticed a dark sedan parked near the side of the building, its engine idling. Something about the car made her uneasy, the way it sat there, motionless, as if waiting. She glanced at the driver's window, but the tint was too dark to see inside. Vanessa quickly paid for her items and left, her heart racing as she hurried back to her car. As she pulled out of the lot, she saw the sedan begin to move, slowly following her. Panic set in, but Vanessa's instincts kicked in. She drove directly to a nearby police substation, pulling into the lot and honking her horn. The sedan sped off before she could get a good look at its license plate, but the interaction was enough to prompt a call to the task force. The details Vanessa provided, especially about the car, aligned with previous witness accounts. Detectives began cross-referencing the description with traffic cameras near the store, hoping to catch the vehicle as it left the scene. Hours of footage were combed through, and finally, they found it: a dark sedan with a faint scratch on the driver's side door, leaving the area around the time Vanessa had reported the encounter. The footage was a goldmine. Investigators tracked the car's movements, noting its route and eventual disappearance into a residential area. It was a lead, but it wasn't enough to make an arrest. They needed more evidence, and they needed it fast. Meanwhile, the shooter struck again. This time, the victim was a 25-year-old named Sarah, who had been walking her dog in a quiet neighborhood just after dusk. The attack mirrored the others, swift, calculated, and with no apparent motive. But this time, the aftermath left something behind: a witness. A man across the street had been sitting on his porch when he noticed the sedan drive by, its lights dim. He'd heard the sharp sounds of the attack and saw the car speed away. What he noticed next was crucial. The car had a distinctive bumper sticker on the rear window. It was small, easy to miss, but it was there, a vital detail that no one else had reported before. The witness's account gave the task force their first truly unique identifier. Detectives quickly expanded their search, cross-referencing vehicles registered in the area that matched both the car's description and the presence of the bumper sticker. The process was painstaking, but it eventually led them to a short list of potential suspects. One name on that list stood out: a man who lived within a mile of several attack sites. His vehicle, a dark blue sedan, matched the description almost perfectly, down to the faint scratch on the door. Further investigation revealed that this man had a history of minor offenses, but nothing that had ever raised significant red flags. His neighbors described him as quiet, keeping to himself, and rarely interacting with others. To the task force, he sounded like a textbook profile of someone capable of the calculated attacks that had terrorized the city. Surveillance on the suspect began immediately. Unmarked vehicles were stationed near his home, and officers monitored his movements around the clock. Days passed with little activity. He went to work, ran errands, and returned home, his routine as mundane as anyone else. But on a warm evening in May, everything changed. The suspect was spotted leaving his house and driving toward a familiar area, one that had been the scene of multiple attacks. Detectives followed him at a distance, careful not to tip him off. He circled the neighborhood several times, his behavior raising suspicions. Finally, he parked near a small park and turned off his lights. The task force, watching from a distance, decided it was time to act. A coordinated team moved in, blocking the vehicle's exit and ordering the driver to step out. The man complied, his demeanor calm, almost unnervingly so. Inside the car, officers found a weapon that matched the ballistics from multiple crime scenes. It was the break they had been waiting for. The man was taken into custody, and the investigation into his background began in earnest. Detectives searched his home, uncovering further evidence that tied him to the string of attacks. Shell casings, maps of the city with certain areas marked, and, perhaps most chillingly, handwritten notes detailing some of the incidents. The man's calm facade cracked under questioning, but he offered no clear motive, only vague statements that hinted at a deep sense of resentment and detachment from society. The city of Phoenix breathed a collective sigh of relief as news of the arrest spread. After more than a year of living in fear, the community finally had a face to the terror that had haunted them. But even as the suspect was led away, questions lingered. How had he managed to elude capture for so long? And most hauntingly, were there more victims yet to be discovered? The arrest of the suspect sent shockwaves through Phoenix. For a city that had spent over a year in the grip of fear, the news brought an overwhelming sense of relief. But for law enforcement, the work was far from over. The suspect might have been in custody, but the evidence needed to secure a conviction still had to be carefully pieced together. Every detail mattered, every shred of proof critical to ensure that justice would be served. Detectives began by thoroughly examining the suspect's home and vehicle. What they found was chilling. In the garage, they uncovered ammunition that matched the ballistics from several crime scenes. A set of maps marked with circles around key areas, many of them attack sites, offered a haunting glimpse into the methodical planning behind the crimes. Even more unsettling were handwritten notes, cryptic in nature but unmistakably tied to the incidents. But the most damning evidence was the firearm recovered during the arrest. Forensic analysts worked tirelessly to match it to the shell casings found at multiple attack sites. Each match further cemented the case against the suspect, connecting him to the string of violence that had plagued the city for so long. The suspect, however, remained an enigma. During initial questioning, he refused to cooperate, offering vague answers that revealed little about his motives. He seemed detached, almost indifferent to the gravity of his situation. Psychologists and profilers were brought in to analyze his behavior, attempting to understand what might have driven him to commit such acts. Their theories pointed to a deep sense of alienation and resentment, but the exact reasons for his actions remained shrouded in mystery. As investigators dug deeper into his past, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The suspect had lived in Phoenix for years, blending into the community without drawing attention. He worked a steady job, kept to himself, and had no significant criminal record beyond minor infractions. To his neighbors, he had been a quiet, unremarkable presence, someone who waved politely but never lingered for conversation. Yet beneath this facade was a man capable of terrorizing an entire city. The trial preparation was exhaustive. Prosecutors knew they had to build an airtight case, one that would leave no room for doubt. They meticulously assembled evidence, from witness testimonies to forensic analyses, each piece a critical part of the puzzle. Survivors and families of victims were interviewed, their accounts adding emotional weight to the mountain of facts. The case wasn't just about proving guilt, it was about ensuring that the full extent of the shooter's actions was brought to light. Meanwhile, the community grappled with the revelations. The suspect's unassuming life, added to the horror of his crimes. It was a reminder that danger could hide behind even the most ordinary appearances. News outlets ran continuous coverage, dissecting every detail of the investigation and trial preparation. The city, still reeling from the trauma of the attacks, watched closely, desperate for closure. In the weeks leading up to the trial, prosecutors faced the daunting task of presenting a narrative that captured the complexity of the case. The random nature of the attacks, the lack of clear motive, and the suspect's eerie silence all posed challenges. But the evidence spoke for itself, painting a picture of a calculated and remorseless individual who had thrived on fear. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was filled with a mix of tension and anticipation. Survivors and family members sat in the gallery, their presence a powerful reminder of the human toll behind the facts and figures. Prosecutors methodically laid out their case, presenting the forensic evidence, detailing the timeline of attacks, and calling witnesses who recounted the terror they had experienced. The defense attempted to cast doubt, pointing to the circumstantial nature of some evidence and suggesting that the randomness of the attacks made it difficult to definitively prove guilt. But each argument was countered with the overwhelming weight of forensic matches, eyewitness accounts, and the suspect's own possessions tying him to the crimes. The firearm alone was enough to solidify the case, its unique markings unmistakably linked to multiple crime scenes. Throughout the trial, the suspect maintained his eerie calm, showing little reaction to the proceedings. His detachment unnerved those in the courtroom, a stark contrast to the emotional testimonies of survivors and families. For them, this was more than a legal battle. It was a chance to confront the person who had caused so much pain and fear. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered a powerful closing argument. They spoke not just of the evidence, but of the lives impacted by the shooter's actions. They described the fear that had gripped the city, the families torn apart, and the survivors left to rebuild their lives. Their message was clear. The shooter's actions had left an indelible mark on Phoenix, and justice demanded accountability. The jury's deliberation was tense, stretching over several days. But when the verdict was finally read, the relief in the courtroom was palpable. The suspect was found guilty on all counts, a decision that brought a sense of closure to the long and harrowing saga. For the survivors and families, it was a moment of justice, though not one that could erase the pain of what they had endured. Even as the trial ended, questions lingered. What had driven the shooter to commit such acts? How had he managed to evade capture for so long? And could anything have been done to prevent the violence? These questions would remain, haunting the city even as it began to heal. The shadow cast by the shooter might have lifted, but the scars he left behind would take far longer to fade. The verdict marked a pivotal moment for Phoenix, but it was not the end of the story. The conviction of the shooter brought a measure of closure, but the community was left grappling with the aftermath of the terror that had gripped the city for over a year. For many, the scars went far deeper than the surface, and the process of healing was just beginning. In the weeks following the trial, investigators continued to piece together the full extent of the suspect's actions. With the shooter now behind bars, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that revealed the calculated precision of a predator who had operated with chilling efficiency. Detectives pored over notes and evidence found in the suspect's home, uncovering additional details that illuminated the scope of his planning. Maps with circled locations, detailed observations about neighborhoods, and even potential targets were found. These discoveries underscored the depth of his fixation, but they also raised new, haunting questions. Were their victims yet unknown? Had he planned attacks that were never carried out? The public wanted answers, and media coverage continued to shine a spotlight on the case. Experts debated the suspect's motives, pointing to a combination of deep-seated resentment and a desire for control. Some speculated that his actions were fueled by a need to instill fear, to manipulate an entire city through random acts of violence. Others argued that his attacks were a way of exerting power in a life where he otherwise felt invisible. The suspect himself provided little insight, maintaining his stoic silence even in the face of life-altering consequences. Survivors and families of victims struggled with the weight of their experiences. For them, the trial was only one chapter in a story that would never truly end. Support groups formed, bringing together those who had been directly affected by the attacks. These gatherings became spaces for shared grief and resilience, where individuals could process their trauma in the company of others who understood. Despite the pain, There was a collective determination to ensure that the memories of those lost were honored and that their lives were remembered for more than the circumstances of their passing. In the broader community, conversations about safety and awareness took center stage. Neighborhoods that had once been held hostage by fear began to rebuild their sense of trust. Residents organized watch groups and worked closely with law enforcement to create safer environments. These efforts marked a turning point, a way of reclaiming the streets that had once felt so dangerous. For the Phoenix Police Department, the case became a blueprint for future investigations. The use of emerging technologies, from traffic camera analysis to advanced ballistics testing, proved invaluable in solving the case. The task force that had spent countless hours chasing down leads and piecing together evidence was lauded for their perseverance. Their work demonstrated the importance of collaboration and innovation in tackling even the most complex cases. But the case also highlighted gaps in the system, challenges that allowed the shooter to evade capture for as long as he did. The randomness of his attacks, combined with his ability to blend into the community, made him difficult to identify. Moving forward, law enforcement agencies across the country took note, adopting strategies to address similar threats more effectively. As time passed, the city of Phoenix began to heal. Memorials were held to honor the lives lost, gatherings that brought together a community that had been fractured but not broken. Streets that had once been empty after dark slowly came back to life, a testament to the resilience of a city determined to move forward. Yet, the memory of those dark days lingered, a reminder of how quickly normalcy could be upended. For the families, survivors, and residents who had lived through the nightmare, the shooter's capture and conviction were significant steps toward justice. But the emotional wounds left behind were not so easily mended. Counseling and community support played crucial roles in helping individuals and families navigate their grief. But the shadow of the shooter's actions remain. The legacy of the Phoenix serial street shooter case is a complex one. It is a story of terror and loss, but also of determination and resilience. It serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, the strength of community, and the tireless efforts of those who work to bring justice to the darkest corners of society. The scars left by the shooter may never fully fade, but they are accompanied by a resolve to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. If today's stories left you shaken by the chaos and fear caused by these killers, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the strange, dark, and mysterious. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss one of our daily uploads. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How do we prevent such horrors and bring justice to the communities affected by these tragedies? Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the face of fear, awareness and resilience can make a difference. Stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next story.